There is a kind of heartbreak that doesn't scream. It doesn't come crashing down with grand endings, harsh words, or obvious betrayal. No, it's more subtle. It seeps in like fog, unnoticed at first, until one day you wake up suffocating in silence. It's the heartbreak of being almost loved. The world doesn't talk about it enough because it doesn't look dramatic. It's not the kind of story that earns sympathy. How do you explain that someone held your hand, but not your heart? That someone made you feel seen, but only in the dim light of their own convenience? You weren't ghosted, you weren't cheated on, but something in you was slowly, invisibly dying because you were emotionally starving. While being served crumbs that looked like a feast, you wanted more depth, more presence, more realness. But you settled because they gave just enough to keep hope alive. This pain is cruel because it's quiet. No one sees the internal conflict. Do you leave someone who isn't hurting you but isn't fully loving you either? Do you mourn a relationship that technically never ended, but emotionally never truly began? You second-guess yourself. Maybe you're asking for too much. Maybe your expectations are too high. Maybe this is all you deserve. This half-love, this conditional affection, this delayed reply, this absence that's disguised as presence, but deep inside, your soul knows the truth. You were not loved fully. You were tolerated. You were a convenience. You were someone they kept on the edge, close enough to touch, but far enough to never be held. This video is for those who were promised a garden and handed thorns, who were told they were special, but treated like an option, who stayed far too long in almost relationships, hoping that love would one day fully arrive. This is your space to finally name what hurt, to find language for what left you breathless, and to begin the slow, sacred process of reclaiming your worth. It begins subtly, with attention that feels rare, with words so well-timed they almost feel like fate, with glances that linger just long enough to make your heart whisper, maybe. But almost love is not a love that walks through the front door of your soul. It tiptoes in, quietly rearranging your expectations. It promises warmth, but offers shade. It pretends to hold space for you, while simultaneously keeping you at arm's length. In the beginning, you think it's real, because it looks like care, because they show up sometimes, because they say the right things enough. But deep down, you begin to feel the hollowness. You start realizing you're always initiating, always waiting, always wondering if you're being too needy, when all you ever asked for was clarity, consistency, presence. The truth is, almost love feeds off your hope. It survives because you want it to be more than it is. And the longer you stay, the more you start mistaking confusion for passion, hot and cold behavior for chemistry, mixed signals for mystery. But there is nothing magical about uncertainty. There's only anxiety dressed in charm. And when they pull away again, you don't get angry. You get quieter. You adjust your needs. You shrink yourself. You start practicing silence instead of honesty. Because every time you ask for more, they make you feel like you're asking for too much. But you're not. You're just slowly learning that almost loved is still ultimately unloved. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from being emotionally strung along. Not ghosted, not rejected, not hated, just tolerated. You're not quite a priority, but not entirely invisible. You exist in the gray, the limbo of someone's indecision, the purgatory of their unspoken fears, the endless waiting room of maybe someday. You begin organizing your life around their inconsistencies. You justify the unanswered texts. You explain away the forgetfulness. You teach yourself not to need much and call it independence. But deep down, you're aching, not because you were abandoned, but because you were half-held. There's a loneliness that comes from sleeping next to someone who's already emotionally gone. There's an emptiness that grows when someone looks at you but never really sees you. There's a slow erosion of self-worth when you love someone who only ever gives you pieces of themselves, but expects your wholeness in return. You smile through it. You laugh at their jokes. You tell your friends it's complicated, but what you really mean is, I'm losing myself trying to matter to someone who can't even decide if I do. And the hardest part, there's no closure, because nothing is officially broken, but everything feels bruised, and somehow, that hurts even more. There is a silence that doesn't echo. It swells. It grows inside of you when you keep hearing, "I care about you," but never feel it in their actions. You begin to carry a grief that has no funeral, a mourning of what could have been, of the intimacy that was promised with words but never delivered in effort. And because they never technically hurt you, you question your own ache. You find yourself apologizing for being emotional, for wanting reassurance, for needing reciprocity. You swallow your longings and wrap them in smiles, learning to live with a hunger for love. In a relationship that only serves crumbs, you convince yourself, maybe this is all I'm meant to have. Maybe this is what love looks like when you're difficult. Maybe love for me will always come like this, conditional, careful, halfway. You don't realize it, but you are slowly bleeding out through tiny invisible cuts, the unreturned messages, the birthday they forgot, the way they never asked how your day really was, the way you keep showing up, and they just let you. Almost love never asks, "How can I hold you better?" It simply assumes you'll adjust, and you do. But deep within you, something sacred begins to dim. Your belief in your own worthiness, your memory of what being cherished actually feels like, your ability to recognize when something is real and when it's just almost. Staying in almost love has a price, not in money or time, but in the currency of self-respect. You slowly trade your truth for their comfort. You downplay your desires so you don't seem too much. You shrink your voice so they don't feel pressured. You start saying it's fine, even when your soul is screaming, "I need more." But every time you stay, you teach yourself that love is supposed to feel like settling. You reinforce the belief that this is the best you can get, and worse, the best you deserve. You start rewriting your story just to justify their chapter. They're just busy. They're not great with emotions. They're not ready. But maybe one day, you fantasize about someday more than you live in today. But someday doesn't heal you. It delays you. It keeps you tethered to a person who doesn't choose you fully, while the world quietly passes by with people who might. The truth, you can't build a life on a foundation that's still being negotiated. You can't feel whole in a love that keeps you fragmented. And no matter how strong your hope is, no matter how patient your love is, you cannot carry a relationship alone and call it mutual. Eventually, staying doesn't mean you love them more. It just means you're abandoning yourself better. There's a special kind of heartbreak that doesn't arrive with goodbyes. It arrives with possibilities. What if they finally open up? What if I just love them a little harder? What if I'm the one who gets through to them? You cling to the echo of what could be, and in doing so, you abandon the reality of what is. Almost love is rarely empty. It's filled just enough to confuse you. They say the right things at the right moments. They hold your hand just when you start to pull away. They remind you of the dream, right when you begin to wake up from it. And you fall again, not into love, but into hope. Hope becomes the hook, and you keep swallowing it, even when it tears at your insides. You tell your friends you're okay. You defend their inconsistencies. You say things like, "They're just complicated," as if complication is a synonym for care. But deep down, you know you're the only one truly fighting for something real. You're writing love letters in the dark, hoping they'll finally light a candle and read them back. And while you're busy loving the potential of them, you lose sight of the truth of you. Eventually, the silence becomes louder than any "I love you" they ever whispered. You begin to notice how quiet it is when you cry alone in bed, how still your phone is on the days you need them most. You notice how they only call when it's convenient, how your laughter fades when you realize they never really ask why you're quiet. You realize that you've memorized every version of them, their moods, their patterns, their childhood wounds, but they still can't remember the name of your favorite song. And that silence, it's not absence, it's information. It's the loudest confirmation that you're giving love to someone who doesn't know how to hold it, or worse, someone who doesn't want to. You tell yourself you're strong for holding on, but sometimes strength looks like letting go. Before you forget how to receive love that doesn't confuse you. Before you forget that love is not supposed to feel like a test. It's not supposed to feel like performing. It's not supposed to make you question whether you're lovable. Real love sees you, without effort, without pretense, and chooses you anyway. Almost love only sees the parts of you that are convenient, and at some point, you have to ask yourself, is their half-hearted version of love worth the full-hearted grief it leaves me with? It's a cruel trick, really, how someone can hurt you while still being nice to you. They check in sometimes. They smile at you like you're the sun. They text "I miss you" after days of silence. They hold your hand in public but never your heart in private. It's confusing because they don't leave. They linger just enough to convince you that maybe you matter. They give you glimpses of what could be, but never the consistency of what should be. And so you stay, not because you're weak, but because you're human, because your heart remembers the moments that felt right, and it clings to them like proof. The kindness in almost love is sharp. It cuts softly, because it doesn't come with cruelty. It comes with confusion, and confusion keeps you chained longer than anger ever could. You wonder if you're asking for too much. You start to shrink. You start to adapt to their inconsistencies, their delays, their quiet departures. And somewhere along the way, you forget that love isn't supposed to feel like begging. You can't build a home in someone who's still burning down their own walls. But try telling that to the part of you that loves them anyway. You see their wounds. You understand their chaos. You tell yourself you can wait, that they'll heal eventually, that if you just love them enough, they'll finally be ready to love you back. But love is not CPR. You can't resuscitate someone's ability to care, and it's not your job to teach someone how to see your worth. When someone isn't ready to love you, they will love your presence but resent your expectations. They will soak up your energy but refuse to give you clarity. And the more you pour into them, the more empty you'll feel, because no amount of your love can compensate for what they haven't cultivated within themselves. Sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do is walk away from the person you love so they can face their reflection without the distraction of your devotion. And sometimes, you have to accept that being ready is not something you can wait someone into. It's something they arrive at on their own or not at all. There's a unique kind of grief reserved for the things that were almost. It's not loud like heartbreak. It's not clean like closure. It lingers in the invisible, in the space between what happened and what you hoped for. How do you mourn someone who was never really yours? How do you cry for a love that never had a beginning, and yet somehow still has an ending? You find yourself grieving the text they never sent, the apology that never came, the version of them that only existed in the future you built alone in your mind. This kind of grief is subtle. It creeps in on quiet nights, when the world is asleep and your mind wanders to the could-have-beens. It settles in your bones like a phantom memory, haunting, but not quite real. People don't understand. They say, it's not like you two were even together, as if love needs a label to be legitimate. As if the pain is any less real just because it didn't come with promises. But you know better. You know that feelings unspoken are often the ones that echo the loudest, and that grief doesn't require a breakup. Sometimes it just needs a moment of brutal realization. They were never going to love you the way you needed. When you walk away from being almost loved, you don't just leave a person behind. You begin the long, tender process of finding yourself again. Because almost love doesn't just bruise your heart, it reshapes your reflection. It makes you question if you were too much, or not enough, or just wrong in ways you can't even articulate. But hear this, you were never too complicated. You were just layered. You were never too emotional. You were simply open. You weren't wrong. You were real. Healing begins not with forgetting them, but with forgiving yourself for staying too long, for hoping too deeply, for loving someone who wasn't equipped to hold you, and then quietly, consistently, you begin to come back to yourself. You start to set boundaries not as walls, but as acts of self-respect. You remember how to speak to yourself kindly. You begin to attract peace, not passion that burns and vanishes. You realize the goal was never to be chosen. It was to choose yourself fully, even in the aftermath of feeling overlooked. You may have been almost loved, but now you're fully becoming. Some stories don't end, they just stop, abruptly, quietly, not with closure, but with silence. And that silence screams. You keep replaying moments. Was it something you said? Something you didn't say? But the truth is, unfinished stories aren't always yours to complete. Sometimes they're fragments left by people who didn't know how to hold something whole. Still, their absence carves into you. You remember the half smiles, the near promises, the way they almost showed up, and the way they never really stayed. You begin to carry their indecision like luggage, heavy, unclaimed. But life, real life, does not live in the land of almost. And healing begins when you stop writing chapters for someone who put down the pen. It takes courage to walk away from a story that never got a proper ending, but even more courage to write your own and make it complete without needing theirs. The antidote to almost love isn't more love from them. It's real love from yourself first. You begin to understand. Being loved halfway isn't a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their capacity. Some people only know how to hold shadows. But you are not made for dim corners. You are made for daylight. And one day, slowly, gently, you will find someone who does not hesitate. Someone who doesn't make you beg for clarity, affection, or consistency. Someone who shows up fully, with no parts missing. But before that, you must become the person who doesn't settle for almost. The person who has looked rejection in the face and still decided to show up bravely, vulnerably, and whole. Healing from almost love is an act of defiance. It's saying, I deserve more than emotional breadcrumbs. And when that day comes, when you are loved in your entirety, you'll feel it not in butterflies, but in peace, in presence, in the calm knowing that this time, it's real. If you've ever been almost loved, know this. You were never the problem. You were simply too much for someone who wasn't ready. And that's not something to apologize for. In Attached by Amir Levine, the author explains, our attachment style can lead us to cling to emotionally unavailable people. We chase their affection, interpret mixed signals as depth, and confuse anxiety with love. In All About Love by Bell Hooks, she writes, love is an act of will, both an intention and an action. What you had wasn't love. It was desire dressed up in ambiguity. It was proximity without presence. It was convenience without commitment. And In the Mountain Is You by Brianna Wiest. She reminds us, your new life is going to cost you your old one. To heal, you have to let go of the fantasy, mourn the illusion, and start choosing people who choose you with certainty, not hesitation. If you felt this message in your soul, not just your ears, don't keep it to yourself. Someone out there is still stuck in an almost love, blaming themselves, waiting for a ghost to come back. Share this, comment your story, subscribe for more soul-deep videos like this. And remember, almost love is still not love. Choose the kind of love that doesn't whisper, but speaks clearly, loudly, and entirely. You deserve the whole thing.